everyone. Today we are going to talk about chapter or assignment 3 from the CPCU 551 text, cause of loss forms. And let's just look at an outline of where we're going today. The first section is going to be the provisions of the cause of loss basic and broad form, and then we'll talk about the exclusions of the basic and broad forms. And then the last section will be the exclusions, limitations, and additional coverages of the special form. But before we do that, let's go back to our components of a sample commercial package policy and look at where we are in context. Remember that at the beginning, in the first chapter, we discussed a little bit about the declarations page of the commercial property policy and the commercial property conditions. And an insured that's purchasing personal property is going to purchase all or some of the building and personal property coverage form. In addition to that, they need to also purchase a cause of loss form. This particular diagram shows the special form. But there are actually 3 possible forms of the cause of loss form: the basic, the broad, and the special form. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. So let's begin with the provisions of the basic and broad forms. Both the basic and the broad forms cover all of these perils that I'm about to talk about. And then at the end of this, we'll talk about a few additional perils that only the broad form covers. So the basic form is less broad than the broad form in terms of causes of loss. And before I begin this, one thing I want to make note of that's in the textbook on page 3.4 in the special blue section is a discussion of proximate cause. For any loss to be covered under the building and personal property coverages, a covered cause of loss must be the proximate cause of loss. The proximate cause of loss doesn't have to be the immediate cause of loss. It just has to be a cause that sets in motion an unbroken chain of events that ultimately produces the loss. However, the proximate cause does have to be closely related in time and distance to the cause of loss. So sometimes some of these causes of loss might not be the direct cause of loss, but if they were the proximate cause of loss, the loss will be covered. And we'll talk about some examples of that as we go through this today. But let's look at these one at a time, starting with fire. Fire is listed as a covered peril without any further description in the policy. In some cases, the policy is elaborated on within the wording of the policy. But in other cases, anytime there is something unclear or ambiguous, it has to go to court. It's disputed and then it goes to court. And as you might remember from Armin 2005, anything ambiguous in the policy is usually interpreted in favor of the insured. But there has arisen questions about what is fire, and courts have interpreted fire to mean hostile fire, not friendly fire. Therefore, if an employee accidentally throws something valuable into, say, an incinerator, as shown in the example in the book, then it wouldn't be considered a covered cause of loss. Another covered peril is lightning, and again, this is listed as a covered peril without further description. But later in the form, you'll see that any loss caused by an artificially generated electrical current is not covered. So a fairly common loss would be a loss in electronic data caused by a surge in a computer. If the surge was caused by lightning, then that would actually be a covered cause of loss. However, if it's covered by excessive voltage, that would not be a covered cause of loss because it's specifically excluded later in the policy. Explosion is another covered cause of loss. The explosion peril goes further than just a state explosion. It excludes the rupture or bursting because of expansion or swelling of the contents of any building or structure caused by or resulting from water. So, if there's excessive moisture, say in an elevator or silo, such as one used for storing grain on a farm, then that would not be covered. Additionally, the explosion peril excludes rupture, bursting, or operation of pressure relief devices by saying that those would not be considered an explosion. The reason insurers exclude these types of perils is because they tend to pose a severe risk, and insurers don't like to write this as part of the commercial property coverage. A business that has this exposure can insure it through equipment breakdown insurance, which is a chapter we'll cover later in the semester. Next, windstorm or hail. Windstorm or hail does not provide coverage for the interior of a building or its contents by rain, snow, sand, or dust, unless it was the force of wind or hail that first caused external damage to the insured structure, allowing the rain, sand, or snow or dust to enter. The windstorm peril does cover wind caused by hurricane and tornado, but the cause of loss form does later exclude water, and we'll talk about that later. But the water exclusion applies to damage caused by surface water or overflow from a body of water, whether wind-driven or not. Figuring out how to determine how much damage resulted from the wind and how much actually resulted from water can be very difficult and can create a lot of disputes between the insured and the insurer. And this is one of the causes of a great deal of litigation that arose after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005, particularly Hurricane Katrina, which caused the breaking of the levees in the New Orleans area. Aircraft or vehicles is also excluded. So this excludes when there is direct physical contact from either a car, truck, any kind of vehicle, or if a plane flies into your building. Riot or civil commotion. So this is damage that ensues during a riot or civil commotion. A recent example of riot or civil commotion was in Ferguson, Missouri. Actually, several instances occurred, and those did involve looting or stealing from businesses as part of the civil commotion. Looting occurring at the time and place of a riot or civil commotion is actually specifically included in the basic and broad form causes of loss. Vandalism covers the willful and malicious damage to or destruction of the insured property. Before 2000, damage to glass that arose from vandalism was excluded. Since 2000, ISO has added deductibles for glass, so small glass breakages aren't covered, and that allows insurers to cover glass as part of the vandalism peril. Sprinkler leakage. This would be the type of sprinklers that are used in businesses to extinguish fires. Next are smoke peril, which we skipped over. The smoke peril is limited to smoke causing sudden and accidental loss or damage. So smoke damage over time that might occur from, say, a factory or anything where there is a gradual damage to property because of smoke from another source, or even an internal source, would not be covered. But sudden and accidental damage is covered. The fire peril actually covers smoke, but only from a hostile fire, whereas the smoke peril extends that coverage to friendly fires caused from, for example, a fireplace or furnace. Sinkhole collapse is also covered. This is a big problem in Florida. The basic and broad form defines sinkhole collapse as loss or damage caused by sudden sinking or collapse of land and underground empty spaces created by the action of water on limestone or dolomite. And again, this refers to sudden and accidental, because any gradual sinkhole collapse that can be predicted is not covered. Lastly, volcanic action. This cause of loss was added after Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. Like many other things, as the environment changes, the standard insurance policy forms change to keep up with them. And now we're going to talk about fungus, which is actually not listed as one of the covered causes of loss. This is an additional coverage, and it's interesting because both the basic and broad form exclude losses resulting from fungus, wet rot, dry rot, and bacteria. But the forms provide additional coverage for fungus, which allows them to reinforce the exclusion, but to provide limited coverage for the exposure. And we won't get into the definition of fungus, but it does also include wet rot, dry rot, and bacteria. The most the insurer will pay for fungus damage is $15,000. So again, it does provide limited coverage for fungus. And part of the problem with the fungus cause of loss is that it's very difficult to ascertain because the date of loss is not determinable. And again, it is provided as an additional coverage, not as a cause of loss, so that the insurer can impose necessary conditions. And one of those conditions is that coverage applies only when the fungus is the result of one or more covered perils, covered causes of loss, that occur during the policy period. It does not exclude fire and lightning because the fungus exclusion does not exclude fungus resulting from fire and lightning. Now let's look at the broad form additional causes of loss. So as I said, all the causes of loss we just discussed are covered by both the basic and broad form, but these next few are only covered by the broad form. They are falling objects, the weight of snow and ice or sleet, water damage that isn't flood, and collapse. Collapse is actually provided as an additional coverage like fungus, not as a cause of loss, which again allows insurers to impose necessary conditions. The insurer agrees to pay for damage caused by an abrupt collapse of a building, and the form states that abrupt collapse means an abrupt falling down or caving in of a building or any part of a building with the result that the building or part of the building cannot be occupied for its intended purpose. It only applies if the collapse is caused by one or more of these perils. Any cause of loss covered by the broad form, hidden building decay, hidden insect or vermin damage, the weight of people or property, the weight of rain that collects on a roof, or the use of defective materials or methods in construction, remodeling, or renovation, if the abrupt collapse occurs during the course of construction, remodeling, or renovation. When defective materials or construction methods contribute to the collapse of a completed building, the collapse is still covered as long as it's caused by one of the broad form perils or one of the perils I just talked about. And just remember that this is not a cause of loss. It's provided as an additional coverage, allowing the insurer to impose necessary conditions, similar to fungus under both the basic and broad form. Now let's look at the exclusions of the basic and broad form. And remember that exclusions apply even if the proximate cause of loss is a covered cause of loss, and they mean that the loss will not be covered. There are 8 exclusions with anti-concurrent causation applied. So before we look at the specific exclusions, I want to look at what is meant by anti-concurrent causation. First, when the anti-concurrent causation language does not apply, it means that a loss is covered when caused by 2 or more independent concurrent perils, only if one of the perils is covered, even if one is excluded. So in other words, when 2 perils are occurring at the same time, such as fire and wind or fire and volcanic eruption, if the anti-concurrent causation language did not apply, this would mean that even if one of them was excluded, the loss would be covered. But the anti-concurrent causation language keeps the policy from covering a loss if just one of the independent concurrent perils is excluded. It does this by saying that the exclusions apply regardless of any other cause or event that contributes concurrently or in any sequence to the loss. So let's look at the 8 exclusions that have the anti-concurrent causation language applied. The basic and broad form exclude ordinance or law causes of loss, and this is when a state or municipality passes an ordinance or law that generally changes the building code, and there is a cost for the owners of the building to comply with the new building codes. These might be adding fire-resistive roofing or an elevator to comply, for example, with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Next, earth movement or earthquake governmental action, which is different from ordinance or law. This is when a government entity or a government operator like police or firefighters seize your property, usually for the protection of the rest of the community. Nuclear hazard, war and military action, utilities services, and let me talk about that one briefly. The utilities services exclusion eliminates coverage for losses related to the failure of power, communication, water, or other utility services to the described location if the failure originates away from the described location, or even if it originates at the described location, but because of a failure of equipment away from the described location. So the loss is covered if the power failure, for example, originates at the insured location. Water is excluded. Some refer to this as the flood exclusion. And fungus is excluded, as we talked about before. It's excluded, but then it's added back in a controlled way under the additional coverage. And one thing I want to say about all 8 of these is, if you'll notice, with the possible exception of governmental action and fungus, the others are excluded most likely because of the catastrophic potential for loss for the insurer. In other words, the insurer would experience a situation where many insureds had the same loss at the same time, or similar loss at the same time. Then there are 4 exclusions with no anti-concurrent causation clause applied. They are the artificially generated current, where damage to property because of usually a power surge causes a loss, the explosion of steam boilers, mechanical breakdown, and neglect. And then there are a couple of special exclusions. One of these reinforces that the basic form doesn't cover water damage, and the other places limitations on the loss of animals. We talked before in Chapter 2 about the fact that animals are covered if they are stock held for sale, such as at a pet store. However, they're only covered if they are killed or forced to be destroyed. If the animal becomes ill, the policy doesn't cover the veterinary cost of taking care of the animal. Now let's turn to the special form. And with this, we're going to look at the exclusions and limitations of the special form. Remember that the special form, much like the special homeowners form, is an open perils form, which covers everything except that which is specifically excluded. So we don't have named perils or named causes of loss to look at. So you have to pay particular attention to the exclusions. And these exclusions are primarily to avoid coverage disputes over non-fortuitous losses, such as wear and tear. But before I get to these, let me mention that all of the basic and broad form exclusions also apply. And most of those were there because of the need to eliminate coverage for catastrophic loss. So again, the exclusions are the same as the basic and broad form exclusion, which as I go through these, think of how each one of them is somewhat within the control of the insured, which makes them not fortuitous. Dishonest or criminal acts, production errors, unexplained disappearance, theft of building materials, maintenance perils, pollution, inventory shortages, and voluntary parting. Let me talk a little bit more about voluntary parting and what that means. Voluntary parting is when an employee of the insured gives away or parts with property, usually because of a scam or fraud or trick. However, it does not eliminate coverage when the property is handed over during an armed robbery. It also does not eliminate coverage if the property is handed over when the employee is distracted with, say, a feigned illness or some kind of flirtation, and an accomplice steals the property while that employee is distracted. In other words, the exclusion doesn't apply unless the employee voluntarily parts with the property. And there are a few more exclusions. Unauthorized instructions, which basically means that if an employee of the insured gives unauthorized instructions and that causes a loss to property, that isn't covered. Also, there are special limits on theft, such as the limit of $2,500 for furs and garments and $2,500 on jewelry and watches. This is one thing that necessitates a need for commercial crime coverage. And then you should take a look at, on pages 3.3 to 3.31, the exclusions that are there to match the broad form conditions, such as the windstorm or hail, smoke, rain, snow, and ice, and leakage exclusions. And then the concurrent causation exclusions, which again are similar to what we discussed about the basic and broad form exclusions. And note it says weather conditions, but this exclusion applies only if weather conditions contribute in any way with a cause or event that is excluded in paragraph 1. And I'm paraphrasing just a bit. But paragraph 1 refers to ordinance or law, earth movement, etc. And you'll see that most of those are comparable to the basic and broad form exclusions that have the anti-concurrent causation language. Finally, there are some additional coverages provided by the special form. First, the property in transit extension. The Property in Transit extension provides up to $5,000 of additional insurance for damage to insured's property that's in a motor vehicle more than 100 feet away from the described premises. It applies only to your personal property, and it does not cover property being transported by a carrier for hire. Also, it's limited to only fire, lightning, explosion, wind or hail, riot or civil commotion, and the vandalism peril, and in some cases theft, and collision and upset of the vehicle. Next, the special form provides for the coverage of the cost of tearing out and replacing any part of the building to repair damage to a system or appliance from which water or other liquid, powder, or molten material has escaped and caused damage. And that's it. If you have any questions about any of this, as always, email me at cberry@ulm.edu.